My name is Mike Pantalon. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm a research scientist at Yale School of Medicine, and I'm the founder of the Center for Progressive Recovery, which is a center that offers client-directed evidence-based treatment for addiction, as well as recovery coach training.
Recovery coach training. That's
Yes.
fascinating.
Yes.
Can you tell me what that is?
Sure. That's, we have health coaches, leadership, executive coaches, but we also have recovery coaches, which up until now has been a group of people who are in addiction recovery themselves, trying to help people get into treatment or to stay abstinent and recovered. But what I'm trying to do is bring evidence-based training to those folks so that they can help people in recovery or find treatment for addiction. So just like a health coach could speak to somebody over the phone or in person about diet and exercise, my recovery coaches talk to their clients about getting into addiction treatment or making the best use of it.
So if I'm understanding right, you're taking what has traditionally been a normal path, which is for somebody who's a recovered addict to go into helping others, and you're actually giving them training and structure and method.
Right. Training, structure, method, all of that. And one can be in recovery to do this work, but they don't need to be. Sure, it's an asset, definitely. But I think people who will be interested in this are parents who have had children who struggled with addiction, health coaches, executive coaches who want to broaden their practice, grow their practices. So this is something anyone can do with the right training.
Yeah, there's been an enormous emphasis in this conference this year and ongoing, and the wellness coaching, the health-related coaching. So you're sitting right in that window with that piece. What's the subject of your presentation at this conference?
So it's advanced motivational coaching, and I take a different spin on advanced strategies than what is typically out there. When I say advanced, I start to think of boiling down a strategy. So bringing it to its essential components, actually fewer techniques rather than more techniques.
What's required in order to be able to appropriately use fewer techniques?
Sure. Okay, well, so let me tell you what the overall technique is. Sure. Motivational coaching, to me, has three components. The acronym is AIR. Motivational coaching should feel like a breath of fresh air to clients. A stands for autonomy, acknowledging that the client decides whether or not to change, why they might want to change, how to change. The second piece is inquiry. That's what the I is. Asking clients questions about all of those issues, what to change, why they might want to change. And R is reflection, reflecting on their answers so that they can hear themselves and figure out what they truly want. But I boil it down to autonomy because that is where we begin. Unless a client feels that they are free and independently choosing what they want to do, if anything, and getting help with all the autonomy suppression that's out there, you have to change, you better change, unless we can zero in on that effectively, I don't think we have a hope of doing the rest. So that's what I mean by advanced techniques. Advanced coaching scales it back down to just one strategy.
So talk to me a little bit about how you would coach around the issue of autonomy, because I agree with you, it's absolutely crucial, sure, especially in an addiction-based, but for any kind of coaching, really.
Right.
Nobody likes to be told what to do.
Nobody likes to be told what to do, but two of the biggest problems we have in health coaching, for example, obesity and addiction. I can't think of two other groups that are told more often by our society, their families, their bosses, their friends, their teachers, that they really have to change. It's almost as if our society has said we have permission to tell these people what to do. And even, don't get me wrong, even though I know that these are very dangerous medical issues, the more we tell people what to do, especially when there's a whole group of us doing it, the harder it is for them to change. So the number one thing in advanced motivational coaching is to acknowledge this autonomy suppression, is to say, yes, I understand a lot of people have told you you have to do this, and only then start to say and convince the client that you believe what you're about to say, that they do not absolutely have to change. And that's when a lot of the people I train, especially recovery coaches, get a tightness in their chest. No, of course they have to change. It's dangerous. My self-worth as a coach is riding on it.
Exactly.
Yeah, if they're aware of what's going on inside of them. But it's crucially important that we first and foremost acknowledge that autonomy suppression.
How did you get to that understanding?
Well, I've been trained by and have been influenced by the folks who've come before me, of course. One of our other speakers here today, Rich Ryan, has helped found the self-determination theory, which has autonomy right at the forefront, so that's not something I came up with. Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick with motivational interviewing, the strategy around how you support someone's autonomy. So those that work, and my research on motivational interviewing over the last 20 years has informed this process.
This advanced motivational coaching model, what does that training look like?
Okay, so up front, people need to know that there are two phases of this work in terms of acknowledging and supporting autonomy. The first is to deal with the autonomy suppression, what I just mentioned before, and the second is to engage in 4 helpful strategies to convince the client that you're not even subtly telling them they need to do this, they better do this, they should do this. I know those actual words seldom come out of a coach's mouth, but we can convey that subtly. So the first part is to deal with the autonomy suppression, and the second is now to enhance it. The first strategy is to simply say what I've been talking about. You don't absolutely have to do this. Just because I'm coaching you doesn't mean that I'm conveying to you that I really want you to do it and that you have to do it. Of course, I'd like it, but that's just me. So saying it's up to you, it's your choice, you don't have to, as hard as that might be, and saying it genuinely, that's one thing. The second is if the client has come to you in an unfair situation, so I call it unfair situations, if an employer has said you need to do this in order to have the health insurance, or if someone has from home has pressured them, we need to acknowledge that that may feel unfair to the client. Another way to acknowledge their autonomy. A third way is to be honest about what you want. So like I said before, the coach should say, yes, of course, I'm here because I do health coaching. What else would I want except for someone to be healthier? But I only want that if you want that. And that's where trainees sometimes get stuck.
Say more about that.
They want it even though the client may not want it. And so we have to be honest about it. It's a myth that what a coach wants does not factor in to the interaction with the coachee. It shouldn't too much, but it's there. So the best way is to acknowledge it.
And it's one of those where if you're training coaches, I'm assuming, it is a sticky point to really make somebody understand that no matter how good their intentions are, they can't project that onto the client.
Right. But they shouldn't, but and they do sometimes, and we're often told just take that out of the equation. You can't take it out unless you acknowledge it. And a lot of coaches, especially recovery coaches that I train, have a hard time with that because they're still feeling inside that they really do want it for the client, even if the client ends up not wanting it so much for themselves. So I tell them, just say that. Say, of course I'd like you to stop drinking. Of course I'd like you to get into treatment. But that's just me. It's not going to last unless you want it also. So let's talk about how
so from the coach's side, the acknowledgement, putting it out there honestly releases the underlying stuff.
Right.
Okay.
And then the coach is more genuine. And we're nothing if we're not genuine and authentic. And the fourth strategy for enhancing autonomy is to leave the discussion for consequences for another time. We're so consequence driven. I mean, that's another part of what our society has done to suppress autonomy. Everything's focused on the results, the outcomes, nothing around how we get there and why someone wants to get to those results. So let's leave alone what will happen if you don't go into treatment. What will happen if you don't put more into this special project at work? Let's leave those consequences alone because that's external motivation that is important but is not going to change the client if the client is resistant to the change at the moment. Let's leave that alone, and instead of figuring out what will happen to you if you don't do this, let's figure out what you care about right now. Why might you ever freely decide to make this change for you?
Good. How do you deal with that kind of resistance? Because I assume that that's very common.
Sure. in terms of client resistance, and I put it in quotes because there's only something for them to resist if we're putting it out there. So I try to take that away first. So acknowledge, this is not feeling good. You're saying, I'm hearing no, I'm hearing maybe, or I'm not so into that. But that's mainly because I've put something out there that says, here's something to do. Here's something you should do, or something that someone else has said you should do. I try to get that off the table by saying, we're here to talk about what you might want, if anything. And it could be what your employer asked you to talk about, what your insurance company asked you to talk about, or with an addicted person, what your family has asked you to talk about here. But we don't have to talk about that. And sometimes I do that right in front of families who are cringing, who are saying, wait a minute, no.
Why is he saying that?
Why is he saying that? Yeah. No, I recently had a family in my practice, and they were upset because their daughter wanted to end treatment. She didn't want to come anymore. She was going back to school, things were better, and objectively speaking, they were. But, you know, treatment usually isn't as short as it was with this client. And so this girl wanted to stop coming altogether. Parents wanted her to keep coming every day. So I said, look, you don't have to come at all. You didn't have to come here today. And then the parents are cringing. And so after about 45 minutes of that, because you can't just say it once, you have to convince the client that you believe it. It's not a trick of reverse psychology. After about 45 minutes of that, and the client is still saying, I don't like this, they made me come, this is stupid. And I, again, one last attempt, I said, you don't have to for them, you don't have to for me. Life will go on if you decide not to come again. But since we're ending at this, our time is almost up, what may happen next? What's your decision? And she said, I want to come twice a week. And even after all these years, it shocked the heck out of me. Where did that come from? So I don't think I know how this really works. But it does, yeah. And she chose it.
So when you have a situation where you feel that the client is feeling significant autonomy, what's the next step?
Right, well then that's when the rest of the motivational coaching can occur, the inquiry and the reflection. So once somebody says, all right, yeah, I'm here, I don't want to do what they told me to do, but I want to do a piece of it, and that's what I'm really committed to, then I move on to the inquiry part of the AIR acronym. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about how it would feel if you were able to accomplish that. What would be your own intrinsic, personally relevant rewards for doing that? And then I would reflect on those until there was a sufficient amount of motivation, and then we could move into the more how-to strategies, the goal setting and the, setting up a plan.
There's been a lot of work around goals at this conference. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you use them in your settings?
Sure, sparingly at first. I want the client almost to get irritated and say, well, I'm ready, let's do something, and then reflect that before I get to that. So the burden is on the motivational part. So I don't really want a client to get irritated, but I want to see that look in their face that says, yeah, I really do want to do this. And then we move to goals. The other thing I do is that the first goal that a client sets for him or herself usually is too much. So I'm always scaling back. A lot of people talk about negotiating goals higher and higher, becoming more and more challenging. I scale back, which is another autonomy enhancement strategy. But what's more important in the earlier goals is a sense of competence and success rather than taking big jumps and strides towards the ultimate outcome.
What do you think is going to be next in your work? What are the edges, the growing pieces?
Well, two things. So bringing more of a focus on the autonomy enhancement, and rather than thinking about it as client-centered, which we've done for almost 100 years, client-directed is the stronger word that phrase that I like to use to acknowledge that there's so much suppression of autonomy that we're working against. So all of my materials are moving towards client-directed. It's completely up to the client. It's not centered around the client where I'm trying to find a place to work my strategies and goals in. It starts and ends with the client. The second thing is recovery coaching. I believe it's a fascinating, exciting, and growing field that needs our evidence-based coaching, training, and attention. And I think, you know, we need an army of coaches to help get people into treatment. And it's not enough for just the doctors and psychologists.
Cool. If people want to find out more about what you're doing in your research, where do they look?
Centerforprogressiverecovery.com. I know it's long. It'll be changed soon, but it's centerforprogressiverecovery.com. Mobile online coach training, as well as treatment for addiction, and or they can find me at michaelpantalon.com as well.